Okay, I am excited to introduce today's webinar focused on Skagit Chinook salmon response to recovery plan actions and environmental variability, presented by Eric Beamer and Mike Lemoyne with Skagit River System Cooperative. My name is Rachel Latchford, and I work for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, where I am part of the National Estuary Program Habitat Strategic Initiative Lead Team, or the Habitat SIL, supporting the floodplains and estuaries implementation strategy. The Habitat SIL is an interagency team supporting the National Estuary Program, co-led by the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Washington Department of Natural Resources. We are focused on advancing Puget Sound recovery through collaborative planning and strategic investments. Through a cooperative agreement with EPA, we award National Estuary Program grants in support of the Puget Sound Action Agenda and implementation strategies. NEP funding supports traditionally difficult to fund actions that catalyze greater opportunities for future recovery progress in Puget Sound. So a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website. We are planning to have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. When we get there, please type a question in the chat or raise your hand and I will facilitate a Q&A. If you are having Zoom issues, please contact my colleague, Rebecca Brown. I'll put her email in the chat. Thank you, Rebecca. So today you will hear from Eric Beamer and Mike Lemoyne of Skagit River System Cooperative. Their presentation will describe findings from habitat status and trends monitoring from before adoption of Puget Sound Chinook recovery plans through the first 15 years of its implementation, and describe the development of an integrated population model framework structure and its initial learning phase for determining environmental and habitat effects of Skagit Chinook population dynamics. This project advances the floodplains and estuaries implementation strategy by providing a tool for effectiveness assessment that improves the recovery community's approach to river basin scale integrated planning and project implementation. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Eric Beamer.
Yeah, hi everyone. This is Eric, and let's see, get this to advance. Yeah. So Mike and I are going to tag team this presentation. As Rachel said, I'll be going first. I'll be covering the kind of an overview of the project and then some key results from and findings from our status and trends work. Then Mike will be talking about the integrated population model and where we're at with it and our plans for finishing the project. So quickly, kind of on the project overview, hopefully a lot of the idea of the project is self-evident in the project description materials that are posted online. But basically, we wanted to create an analytical tool that we could evaluate the effects of the salmon recovery plan implementation on the population. So, and we wanted to develop a method that reflected the complexities of the actual Chinook population. So in that case, with Chinook salmon, we have to have multiple life stages, and we know that the environmental variability influences those, and we're hoping that in our salmon recovery plan, our strategies are correct, and that as we change habitat quality and quantity, that we're influencing the population. So it's different than a lot of models that are done and called and used in salmon recovery. A lot of those models aren't retrospective like ours is, but they're more predictive. So the models that are used in, say, run forecasting, folks are really used to, but a lot of the limiting factors type models are predictive. And so they're very different than what we're trying to do, where we're trying to look backwards and see if there is an effect, knowing that there's all these other confounding issues like environment, density dependence, and those sorts of things. So Mike will get into that a lot more detail on how we structured the model and why we need to use the IPM. But that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. The other thing that's sort of new in thinking, at least across my career, which started in the 80s, is we started with managing salmon by knowing how many fish escaped and then using that as guidance for man. Then it was novel to have fish in and fish out. So we just had smolts coming out and we were looking at how things work then. But for Chinook salmon, and specifically for recovery plans, we have all these actions that are aimed at individual life stages. So ideally, we need to have data for each life stage sort of reflected in the boxes or triangles here, or even the transitions between the boxes and triangles. So in an ideal world, we're looking towards having data for environment, fish life stage, and habitat in all those boxes. And again, Mike will go into the details on that. And I'll be reporting now on the habitat status and trends that go into the key Skagit Chinook recovery plan strategies. So first, I'm going to back up, and folks might be used to results change from the Puget Sound Chinook recovery planning process, where you basically have a sequence that you have a strategy for some kind of actions, and they beget different results before they achieve a goal. So the more important thing is that it's a sequence and there's multiple intermediate results before you get to the goal. Often in the old, especially in the old days, you did something, you have a strategy, and then you look for it at the very end. So it might be in the fish in model, it would be, well, let's do something on the spawning grounds and then wait a long time for fish to come back and expect to see more spawners. Well, there's so many intermediate results that you're missing that you may or may not even have a signal. You have no idea what's happening. So these intermediate results are super important, and they also are influenced by other strategy. Now in the Puget Sound recovery plan process, these results chains became very, very complex. Some folks might be used to them. It's almost like spaghetti art, but the basic concepts are, it's a sequence, you have a strategy, it begets certain actions, you have results, but you need to keep in mind that those may be influenced by other things, and it's hopefully ending with a particular outcome. In our case, we need to monitor those intermediate results, and that's like the most important part in putting the life cycle, life stage models together. So we have in our case, we have data for all those areas, habitat status and trends being monitored at the action level and at the intermediate result level, and then we have environmental data and biological data also interacting with the intermediate results or the endpoints. So I'm going to look at the main action chapters in the Skagit Chinook Recovery Plan, or SRP, Salmon Recovery Plan. We're really chapters 9, 10, and 11. And I'm going to give you sort of the answers so that you know the big picture before we delve into sort of the details of the habitat status and trends data, which is the bulk of my talk. So chapter 9 was about spawning and egg incubation habitat. 10 was freshwater rearing habitat. Again, going back to these specific life stages, the Chinook salmon. Chapter 11, estuary rearing habitat. All of them had goals. So the sort of the biological goal is for chapter 9 is to increase egg to fry survival. Biological goal for chapter 10 was to increase freshwater rearing capacity of par migrants, a specific life history type that stays in freshwater for a period of time to achieve growth and before they outmigrate. And then the estuary chapter was to increase capacity for estuarine rearing life history types. So embedded in the overall plan were these sort of sub goals or objectives related to individual chapters. So they have individual results chains, if you will, and I'll kind of walk you through those later on. But chapter 9, the cool thing is the actions were fully implemented, and that was to treat forest roads so they wouldn't landslide into streams. apply appropriate buffers on risk areas for landsliding to forest practices. And what we found was landslide volume decreased. And that's a cool story, because that's a salmon recovery strategy applied or conceived and then implemented, and you're seeing a response. So at the habitat level. And then chapter 10 was the rearing habitat 1. And so we see that there's quite a bit of restoration that's occurred. We're seeing an increase in freshwater habitat extent caused by natural and restoration. And that one kind of take-home message for all of this is that many of the restoration projects would have delayed sort of benefits on fish. So that's something to keep in mind. And Mike will, is forced to pick up on that in the modeling side of things, like how do we model appropriately the treatment effects of restoration. And then for the estuary, it's the same sort of thing as chapter 10. Restoration's been completed, not all of it, of course, but we can see a signal of change in the habitat. And in this case, the projects have more of an immediate benefit, although I wouldn't say totally immediate, but you see the fish use right away. And that's known because of the Skagit IMW, which focused on the estuary. So I'm going to delve into the restoration projects and just try to get you a map view. So we had to integrate our habitat status and trends data with what we knew about projects applied to the landscape. And these dots are sort of my best representation out of the databases that record restoration completed and where they're located kind of spatially across the basin, and whether they're in the estuary, in the non-tidal delta, which is geomorphic delta, but it's fresh, it's entirely fresh water. It's also pretty much entirely diked the whole way between the upper watershed and the delta. And then you have the large river floodplain areas of the Skagit, Sauk, Suwattle, and even Cascade rivers, where a lot of the action has been, a lot of the habitat, most of the habitat and a lot of the restoration action has occurred. And then there's restoration that's occurred in Chinook-bearing tributaries and their alluvial fans, also shown. So there's I had to bin the projects into sort of treatment types, so restoration type. And so we have fish passage, in-stream projects, and then a group of hydrologic projects that change the hydrology of the floodplain or channels, and then riparian projects. So fish passage projects is kind of a broad group. They include reconnection of isolated channels. They also include removing an impassable culvert with a passable one, those sorts of things. So it's the idea of reconnecting isolated habitat or historically isolated habitat. And then I just showing the number of project types across the landscape for the freshwater rearing areas. We'll get to the delta and the forest road areas kind of separately. They're treated separately. So restoration effect over time. These are going to be hard to see, but I just want to give you a snapshot of what you get when you look at restoration databases, restoration product databases, and how good or bad it is for using for our purposes. So, so the first category is fish passage. And projects so I'm showing it plotted over time. Our IPM time horizon goes from about 1992 to 2021. And so we see effect size of fish passage projects on floodplain channel on the right in terms of hectares opened up. So area of channel opened up to fish rearing. And then that's on the left, sorry. And then on the right, it's tributary habitat, Chinook tribs, and floodplain channels, and it's reported in channel length. These are not the same results. The benefit of fish passage on freshwater rearing habitat is the sum of both of those. So you can see they're in different units, and that's how they're reported in the databases. mine more, I should say, more mined out of the databases, because they're clunky to get the information. In-stream structures, I've lumped ELJs with just individual wood pieces added to streams. And so in this case, they're reported as count on the left, and miles or length of stream treated. So again, 2 different units, but again, some project, although way less treatment effect than the fish passage overall fish passage category. Another category is these hydrologic process. So they're reported in 3 bins. I saw 3 bins in the data where you have structures and channel, floodplain structure and channel crossings removed, and those are reported as count. And you also have the same sort of idea where things are removed, but you have a response area to that, and that's the middle graph. So that's hectares of either floodplain or channel influenced by the removal of those. And then the last one is length of structures, and those tend to be things like dikes and road, things that are long and skinny that are measured, and those are generally measured as lengths. And then lastly, riparian. Fortunately, in our basin, we had a separate database from the lead entity, which is the Skagit Watershed Council, which has a lot of detail on riparian planting, and riparian planting or re-veg projects occurred in the estuary, non-tidal delta, large river floodplains, and in the tribs. And in total, it's a large effect. Up to over 900 hectares have been planted, accumulating. That's not counting for maintenance projects. A lot of these, almost everywhere, requires maintenance, so those plants can continue to grow. But basically, you have a big signal in riparian planting and restoration, about 42 hectares per year since the recovery plan. So we looked at the restoration project data and looked at whether it's being detected in our habitat status and trends data, and the answer is sorta. Depends on the types. And so really, there's not a lot of sample size here for some types that are really like in-stream large woody jams. We only had 1 of those projects, and it was detected by the habitat status and trend. But basically, it's a story of non-detection or under-detection. And then I looked at whether or not we could detect these things on ortho photos after you knew where the project was located, and you did a little bit better. So this is an important thing to feed back into a habitat status and trends methodology, or figuring out how to use the restoration data as a covariate and with the habitat status and trends data and analysis. So we're in theory, we're supposed to detect the restoration in the habitat status and trends. In reality, we're not doing that very well. Okay, that's restoration projects. Now I'll go through the 3 chapters. So we have a results chain for each chapter. In the case of chapter 9, the strategy is to retain forest on unstable slopes, and we applied a road maintenance strategy, regulatory strategy on the state and private lands for treating roads, and decommissioned high priority unstable roads on federal lands. So you're basically going out, treating the roads. I don't actually know anything about that other than you're removing unstable fills and unneeded crossings and those sorts of things. I don't do that work. We expect that the roads are stabilized when that work's done. The other part is a management thing where you're basically getting buffers on the sensitive, risky areas. And the intermediate result for those 2 things combined is less landslides, which should beget better channel conditions, which should beget the improvements to biological response. So we have the habitat status and trends, we have these interactions, and here's the answers for the roads. So this is a cool implementation story. Our Forest and Fish program did this work where they went out and inventoried the roads. using LiDAR and field surveys, and they find that in this case, we're showing it as the percent of substandard or not treated roads left on the landscape. And you'll see on federal lands, there's some that are untreated, but all the high priority ones, or most of them, have been done. But the state and private lands had kind of two permitting tracks, but they both have been done, completed at this point. And then so we look at the landslides, which is an aerial photo inventory process following Kari Parsons' thesis and others, where we basically measure landslide area on aerial photos, and you stratify it by geology, landform, and management, and you can scale that up and estimate volume of sediment delivered over time. And so the map on the right just shows the basins, the intensive monitoring going on in the basins by their management regime. Ongoing management is or areas where active forest practices are occurring. Legacy management is federal lands where prior to the Northwest Forest Plan, we had active forest management, but it's basically stopped now since the 80s. And no management are basically wilderness areas that are forested and they never were logged. And then the non-forested is basically alpine. So on the right is the trend line, and basically you can look at the patterns for each of the management regimes and see what the total is. So it's been that's kind of a steppy decline, but definitely a decline. One thing I want to just go through, and this is an example for all the responses for habitat, and that it can be complicated. So in case landslides is a really good example for why it's complicated. So it goes down to this other influence of other factors. So landslides are only part of the sediment budget. We have other sediment fractions in the basin that matter. But the landslide part is the one that humans really are influencing, at least in forestry. So the effects are sort of not applied uniform across the basin. So it impacts at tribs most. And then there's attenuation as that sediment that's delivered to streams moves through the channel network. It changes when and where it's influencing, but it also decreases over time. And there's also not just this time when the sediment moves through or by a reach, but there can be legacy in fact. But so for all those reasons, we have to figure out how to lag or how to interpret that for the NTA. So in this case, I just did a 20-year lag, and you see, and this isn't right, but this is just illustrative that it really matters how you would understand the complicated response of sediment when you're looking for a biological response. So it's almost reversed if you lag it 20 years, and that may be true, it may not be true. That's something that we have to wade through. And on top of that, and this is an important component too, which is why I wanted to go through this example, is that the recovery plans our recovery plans largely silent about when benefits would accrue. This is especially true for landslides, chapter 9, but it's also true for other chapters where you are doing riparian projects. You know you don't get much of a benefit until the trees start to grow. And it's decades, even centuries before you get large pieces of wood recruiting to stream channels. So that part of recovery plans is sort of undersold, and I think the public is maybe somewhat confused about that. And it's very complicated to deal with the analytical side of it that we're trying to do in our model. Okay, freshwater. So we have a strategy to protect and increase rearing habitat. We do that through multiple project types, which I basically showed you. One thing that we wanted to do in the plan was reduce habitat opportunity gaps. I don't really have anything to show you on that. But we have the databases. So we got our restoration data from the PRISM and also the lead entity databases. And then we have our habitat status and trends to measure the changes in habitat. And then we have it linking to the response. So basically, I'm going to show you the freshwater floodplain, main stem edge and floodplain part of things. And this is a good example. This is around Rockport. And basically, we use the methodology that Tim Beachy and others developed, and we map floodplain, all the areas within the large river floodplains. I'm only showing the channels and the main stem channel edge, and those are our habitat types. I also want to just show you how things change naturally, because that's a huge signal in our data. So that's Rockport area in 2006 versus 2015. There's an avulsion, and you can see the avulsion captured like that off-channel habitat and to the north side at the junction with the Sauk River, and basically subsumed the floodplain channels that were there. So that's a common thing that's happened in our unconstrained reaches, but that's what you see in the habitat status and trends data. So we scale this. We scale for estuary and freshwater rearing. We scale the habitat data into a freshwater rearing index, or a rearing index for the IPM. So we have one result each year across the data set, and this is how it works for freshwater. We're taking length-based data and converting it to area, and we're taking all the area data by the different habitat types and multiplying it by an intrinsic fish potential, which is a density, after Krista Bartz and all in 2006. So that was done for the Snohomish, and she did a literature review kind of all the distributions of fish Chinook density by those habitat types, and so we use that as our way to scale it up. And then we just sum it for everything. So basically, here's the answers for our freshwater habitat. So we see by channel type, freshwater up in the upper left is floodplain channel, followed by main stem bank edge, main stem bar edge, and then on the right, main stem backwater is main stem modified banks, so hydromodified banks, and then a sum of it all together. So we see some trends up and some trends down, and it does make sense, actually. First of all, we see when you sum it all up in the currency of the Bartz et al., we go from 1.8 million intrinsic capacity or potential to 2 million over that time period of 92 to 2001 or 2021. And then it makes sense when you audit the restoration projects. Yes, we did floodplain channel reconnection, so that makes sense, have an increasing trend. We see that we remove some hydro modification, so that makes sense, a reduction, and you can see the Y scale is actually pretty small, so the effect actually is quite small, but it is a reduction in modified bank. And then when you look at the account for natural change and removal of floodplain process impediments, it makes sense that you would increase floodplain channel with the avulsion, the natural avulsions. You'd have that flip-flopping of channels, and as the channels migrate, you have more bar habitat and less bank habitat in its new condition. So that makes sense. And then lastly, this one didn't make sense to me, but we had natural changes explain the reduction in backwaters. A lot of these avulsion areas now are floodplain channel dominated and not so much with a backwater that, and that backwater may be a senescing sort of outcome later on, that you would see more backwaters as those areas age. Estuary, I'm almost done. So we're to the estuary. We have a strategy to increase habitat area, increase its connectivity, and then have diversity. Really only going to show you changes in the area, but I will mention that there's subdelta diversity in how they're trending. So we have the project data. In this case, 100% of the projects that changed tidal area were detected by the habitat status and trends. So that was good news. And we have our habitat status and trends data. So we have these 5 subdelta areas. Really, there's only 4. There's a little tiny one up at the branch we call lower river main stem. It's basically a constant in our data set. It's the main channel that neither contributes to the South Fork or the North Fork. It's just its own thing. But we have the North Fork, South Fork, Bayfront, and Swin Channel shown on the left. And we have our habitat classification system applied across all that. And it's after Greg Hood's first allometry paper in 2007 with the different habitat types. So this is the good news part about the detections and change. So basically, like I said, 100% of the restoration projects that changed tidal footprint in the Delta were detected by habitat status and trends. They're shown as yellow polygons as gain. And then, and largely there's a big gain in the, or a significant gain in the amount of tidal delta habitat due to restoration. And the other good news is there's hardly any loss, just very, very minor losses due to human causes. Only 2 occurrences, and they're both really small. We also see natural gains and losses. So those are shown as beige and red. And the gains are in the North Fork, where we had a channel of Olshan, and downstream of that, we're getting new sediment dynamics, so we're gaining habitat. And then we're having losses on the seaward edge. And there's a paper on that from 2016 that suggests that that's from sea level rise as well as sediment shadowing from the delta dikes. So all in all, it's a good story. We got a lot of restoration. We're seeing the benefits. We're seeing a signal, and how do we scale it up for the IPM? So again, we take the area estimates of the habitat that fish use, and we convert it into what's a prime rearing area number from a learning project, a ESRP learning project that Corey Green was the main author on. And it's basically the areas that rearing Chinook are using for lengths of time in the Delta and avoiding sort of the migratory corridors. So it's only giving credit to the perimeters and the edges of the large channels that are more the migratory areas or disturbed habitats like harbors. So we have a way to fill in the details from the observations, which use the progradation rates from the paper I mentioned from Greg Hood in 2006. So, and we know when the restoration projects occurred. So basically, here's the answer for habitat. You see this sort of stepwise gain of habitat area with the dark black line series, which is on your y-axis on the left, which is the total prime rearing area, goes from about 150 hectares to over 200. And then if you do a net zero version of that, which is on the secondary axis, you see it's more accentuated. You see the step ups, but you also see these declines, and that's because of the erosion, the bayfront losses. And those, I just want to highlight one other thing about that is that the changes are also within the tidal delta footprint. So in the case of the avulsion, we're gaining habitat because of this, the filled areas are becoming blind channel and marsh, those beige polygons, in contrast to the eroded out area of the new avulsion channel, which is now the main stem or the main North Fork channel. So we have those changes. And then also projects are changing. So an as-built project example like Wiley was built with a lot of subsided, it subsided, so it had a lot of impoundments, but over time, those are morphing into tidal channels and marsh. So that's the equilibrium condition. So that changes the primary habitat numbers, and that's the reason why those are going up and down in addition to the restoration or the bayfront of erosion. Okay, lastly, takeaways. So the actions have been implemented. That's a good news. We can detect that. We know that. Throughout the basin, we can see there's an overall improvement in the plan, in part due to restoration. And the other nice thing is that at least by our methods, we're not seeing huge signals of anthropogenic losses. And then sort of a non-story, but really a story, is that habitat's naturally varying. So I think the avulsion story in the wider floodplains is interesting and important. And what's going on in the Delta is also very new, to be able to track that things are gaining and losing, and there's probably a trend, a long-term trend of bayfront erosion. So we shouldn't be surprised things naturally vary, but being able to quantify that's super important. There's a bunch of things about the restoration projects that we need to feed back into our methods. So we didn't do a very good job of detecting things, so we need to evaluate our methods moving forward. We need to look at frequency of observations as an issue too. And then one sort of notable exception is the Skagit IMW, where in 2005, we intentionally tracked restoration with habitat status and trends with life stage monitoring. And so that's a project in of itself, and it's sort of a notable exception. If we could do that, apply that sort of mindset across the whole watershed, we'd be in a better situation. We wouldn't have to reevaluate some of our methods. And now that just the issue of how do you recognize the complexities of these interaction factors and how to line it up with IPM is an analytical issue, but an important one. That's it.
All right, thanks, Eric. I will go to my screen now. Can you see my main screen? Great,
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so Eric addressed a lot of the inputs associated with the habitat changes and really the restoration actions that happen across the landscape that we're going to try to feed into a population model that incorporates the entire life cycle of Chinook salmon. And so, so that you're not sitting on the edge of your seats in the start of this, is that we're not completed with the IPM. And so what I'm going to present is where we are currently with it and our evaluation phase. And some of you might be thinking, what is an integrated population model? Well, really simply is a population model that tends to integrate different aspects into a similar structure. This could be incorporating multiple time series of data together in a life cycle approach, or it could be incorporating count data with life table, the old Leslie matrices, if you're familiar with those, or potentially using predictions and or theories incorporated into the data synthesis, like a general Bayesian approach. So integrated population models is kind of a really large umbrella for a whole suite of models out there. But the idea is that they are integrated in some kind of joint likelihood, one kind of single equation that encompasses a complicated population structure. Within this house of models, we're specifically leveraging a state-space modeling approach. And specifically, a state-space model is applied to time series data. And when we think about fish response in Puget Sound, a lot of the information that we get are from spawn ground survey counts, smolt trap counts, and wherever we might catch fish to produce annualized counts. And this sets up a time series kind of analytical framework. And within a state-space approach, what we can do is kind of view each count as a state, and we're trying to evaluate the transition between those states. So my example here on the right are our classic stock recruitment functions, Ricker, Beverly Holt, that I borrowed from Mark Sherrell's paper. And simply, we can use the state-space approach to evaluate from one time step a stock at time or adult at time t, and then moving it forward as some kind of either future adult or future count at time t+1. And one of the powers of the state-space approach is that you can also develop in hierarchy where you can portion out measurement error. So the model tries to identify what was the process that is happening within the system and what seems to be the noise in the measurement error. Our approach isn't new for the Skagit. We have two working examples of state-space models that are adult-to-adult models. Mark Sherrell et al., which Eric and Casey and others were co-authors, is an adult-to-adult steelhead model that allows us to evaluate intrinsic productivity and carrying capacity of steelhead within the Skagit. Casey Ruff, who's now with Swinomish, adapted this approach to develop a forecast model for Chinook within the Skagit, both summer and spring run. And so what our intent here was to try to build off this framing that already exists in the Skagit. And we're trying to build it to include what we call a multi-stage state space approach, where we have counts from instead of adult to adult, that we move counts into from a returning spawners into river smolts, potentially what we're calling an estuarine fry. So in the Skagit River Basin, fry migrants, those individuals that leave the river system early and rear within our deltas and estuaries, are considered a fry migrant. And we have continual counts of those over a long period of time, as Eric alluded to in the Skagit IMW. And then estimating the number of returners from harvest records all the way out from Alaska all the way in. And so if we can do this, we can apply different covariates to evaluate what is influencing the population dynamics across the life cycle, both internally to the actual population dynamics, such as density dependent forces, any Lee effects, those type of things, to stochastic environmental processes, being ocean conditions, estuarine temperature, or even recovery actions. And the current model framing that we're working with was developed in a Bayesian framework within JAGS. So what I just presented to you is kind of our theoretical dream of developing the state-space approach. And this is where we are right now. We basically have observed harvest, escapement, and smolts as our data inputs to the state space, the multi-stage state space model. And from this, we can get estimated spawners, estimated smolts, and estimated returners from the model structure that can give us basically predictions of the time series of the counts across those specific states. The transition with the states right now, we've evaluated that adult to smolt, so this would be our freshwater side of the system, is estimated in a density independent. We've done some evaluations to try to figure out what is the best relationship between these two, and really it's a density independent relationship. At this freshwater stage, we've also just initially evaluated air temperature influences on productivity from adult to smolt, and flooding reoccurrence interval. The next transition is really what we call the smolt to adult. And this is more the marine phase, dealing with the estuary rearing and open ocean conditions. And again, we evaluated the demographic processes that might be controlling the population, which we found would be a density dependent relationship. So under this, a Richter curve seemed to be the best explanatory functional relationship between smolt and adults. And then we were able to apply the hand measure of delta temperatures across the estuary on an annualized basis, and then some ocean conditions. And again, we are just at the point of just trying to evaluate how the model's operating and how do we think it's performing. And where you're dealing with more complicated models like this, especially models in hierarchy, you're really going beyond the Gaussian distribution and the old student t-tests. So those evaluations to validate model structure that you may have learned in school are kind of out the window. And we have to kind of look at, build an inference in how we believe that the model is performing. And so where we're at is we're in this building of inference to make sure that our current approach that we've developed, our analytical framework, is actually giving us what we believe is somewhat truth. No model is perfect. There's always some kind of error, but we really want to identify what are our biases potentially in the model structure, and if our math is correct, if you will. And so the first step that you can do is you can try two different methods and see if they're congruent. And so we've done that through the state-space approach, have done evaluation of specific demographic parameters and the covariates. And then we applied a single kind of stock recruitment curve and an NLS. And do they give us comparable results as we build this inference of, does our approach give us a sense of truth? We also want to evaluate in more of a validation kind of mindset. Does our predicted time series match our observed time series? Do the number of smolts that we predict across the years similar to those observed at the smolt trap? We also want to evaluate, are the parameters being derived biologically meaningful and consistent with other work that's happened regionally? So this is not the first attempt at a life cycle model and or a stock recruitment function. So we should be able to look and say, is it following the same kind of story and understanding? And then finally, we wanted to simulate some data and throw some simulated data within the model structure. And within the simulated data, we can basically tell it exactly what we think the functional relationships are between adult and smolt and to adult, and have a known population dynamic in which we can evaluate in the model structure. And over here to my right is my fun little cartoon of the stick person dealing with the student T distribution and throwing it out, and then looking at the teacher's T distribution for a fun comic. Yeah, mix it up once in a while when you talk about the quantitative models. So to start with, we want to look at the comparison between the state space model, the two-stage Bayesian here on the left, is the left two figures, versus our single stage non-least squares evaluation to the right. And first is recruitment. Recruitment's one of the estimated parameters within the evaluation structure. And the dark blue line on these graphs is the central tendency of the predicted values. The light blue is the credible intervals of the predicted values or the confidence intervals when you're dealing with NLS. And then the black dots are the actual observed recruitment or estimated by the co-managers for the Skagit Basin. And so what we can see here is that really what I'm looking at is, are the black dots really incorporated within the time series of the data? And really, to start out with, the Bayesian approach incorporates the observed estimates of recruitment and smolts a little fairly better than NLS. In addition, what I'm looking at is, are we getting widely different relationships within the different time series of the data? And no, we're getting some similar results. However, I would say that in the NLS here for smolts, we have this kind of double interesting, well, I guess it's incorporated both, I would point out, but we see here that there's less of a plateau being incorporated here, but we are getting the dips and the valleys, even though it's a little bit different, it seems similar. So the next thing is actually looking at the parameter estimates for each of the models. So on top here is the two-stage Bayesian, and the bottom is the NLS, non-least squares approach. And then starting on the left side, our freshwater, here's our adult to smolt productivity. This is our freshwater productivity. And what we have is the posterior distributions of each approach. And then the light blue box is the credible intervals. And what I'm looking at is trying to see, are we getting overlap? Are the two approaches giving us congruent parameter estimates for adult to smolt productivity? And the answer is yes. We see some decent overlap here. In the marine stage, which is the smolt to adult, and to remind you, we ran density dependent Ricker curve on this, so we have smolt carrying capacity. We also see high degree of overlap. So we're seeing model congruency here. In addition, harkening back to the older 2005 Skagit recovery plan, we're seeing similar rates as with that. So we're building this inference of confidence around our model structure. For covariates, we see that there's a little bit of offset between the Bayesian state space model and the NLS approach, but there's still a decent amount of overlap. Now, I don't expect these to be one-to-one. I don't expect these to be exactly the same, but are they giving us similar answers? Yes. Next, we look at some of the smolt to adults. These are marine covariates. And the first thing I want to point out is NPGO is a very common parameter in a lot of stock recruitment evaluations for salmon. And first, we have model congruency here. And then second, Satterwhite et al. 2020 had similar results of NPGO and coastal upwelling index, QE, for that we are actually estimating in the Skagit. Again, giving us a sense that the model is performing pretty well. In addition, our El Nino index and the influence of delta temperature in each model is about the same. Now, some of you might want to actually dive into the results and actually look at the effect sizes. I strongly encourage you not to in this because these are not fully parameterized models. Next is the simulated data, and this is where it gets a little interesting. So we've run one thing that's really great about simulated data is that you can run many simulations, and you can kind of see where are the boundaries of your analytical framework, where does it start breaking down, and then you can reference back to your real situation, your real data, and try to determine if you're at those boundaries. And so here I only represent 3. I believe we're somewhere around 30 to 40 simulated data sets and analyses at this point. But to give you an example of what we're seeing is simulation 1 is basically our best representation. We took the model output and we just simulated a data set from the model output. And what I have highlighted here in yellow is the difference between the simulated data and the actual analysis. And generally in the simulation 1, we see that productivity is overestimated. It estimates higher than the actual productivity from smolt to adult. This is the marine productivity. And then underestimates, says capacity is lower than what it actually is in that marine phase. So we decided to play around with it. And in simulation 2, we decided to cut productivity in half and see, does that change this relationship between these two parameters? Sure enough, the model still over predicts smolt adult productivity and under predicts capacity, saying capacity is lower than it actually is. One thought about this is that there's a few publications out there that say that you need at least 30 years or more of a time series data set to accurately estimate productivity and capacity. And so we ended up running 100 years. So we made up 100 years of data within our simulation. And again, we see this problem is consistent across all our simulations, where we're over predicting productivity and under predicting capacity. And that's a little bit of a concern with our simulated data because the capacity in the estuary is actually a recovery goal, increasing the capacity because we assume capacity is low. So this provided us some pause in our analytical approach, and that we want to go through and do a little bit more evaluation. So where are we at this point? Basically, we have congruence between the state space model and NLS, and it looks like the state space model is handling the data better than NLS approach. So we have model congruence, and that's the state space model is actually producing reasonable covariates for the covariates that we applied to the model structure. But where we have some concerns is the smolt to adult simulated data, and it seems to consistently overestimate productivity and consistently underestimate capacity. So I try to represent here on the right in a little graph is that we're seeing a shift in the curvature of the relationship. And really this falls under the premise of parameter identifiability. And this is an issue when you deal with hierarchical models or you have multiple parameters that you're trying to estimate at the same time. And so the model doesn't quite know, or the math doesn't quite know exactly where to attribute the parameters specifically. And so while this isn't uncommon, it's actually very common, you want to move cautiously forward. And ways in which we can constrain the model to help inform it better is with the priors in the Bayesian world. But before we do that, we want to make sure that we have a good sense of we're not overly informing the model structure moving forward. So the next steps is that, like I said, oh, I just got ahead of myself. Like I said, we'd like to, in a number of ways to handle parameter identifiability, but one is looking at constrained priors with the evaluation to help kind of direct the model. But the thing is, we want to double check looking at the sensitivity of providing informative priors, and there's ways in which you can test for that as well. The other one is that we are currently not complete with our life cycle model, that we want to include a delta state in there. So getting count data from the delta. I have gone through and have an estimate of annualized delta abundance for the Skagit Delta, but we have yet to implement it in the model structure. And then honestly, the one thing is that we're using estimated abundance here. So co-manager, spawner abundance, smolt trap abundance. And really some ways in which state space models shine is if you actually go with raw counts. And one thing that we're discussing or thinking about is just instead of using the estimated abundances, which can have differences in error structure, and then when that model and hierarchy deals with process error and measurement error, it has a problem really attributing those differently. And if we actually went to red counts, smolt catch, or delta catch, that'd be a way to allow the model to do its thing and not trying to have estimated abundance in there. As Eric said, this idea of lag effects has actually, he didn't mention, but actually spurred from a collaboration with NOAA, specifically evaluating the estuary. So we might want to think about these habitat lag effects within the model structure. And so in ending, what I just want to highlight is that here in the Skagit and in other places, but one that I know fairly well is the Skagit, is that we try to develop a strategy that has quantitative goals and then set those actions and the strategy that are quantitative goals in biology set with the needs of Chinook. And then moving forward, trying to track those intermediate results as best we can. And even though we haven't quite got there at looking at the biological response, we're still heading that way and we're still working on this model development. So with that, I thank everyone here and the Puget Sound National Estuary Program for supporting this work, and yeah, take questions.
Thanks so much, Mike and Eric, for those great presentations. All right, we have a couple minutes, so I want to open it up for questions. So feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat. Let's see. Okay, any questions? Pat, I see a hand. Go ahead, Pat.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric and Mike. That was a great presentation. I just had a quick question coming from a very sediment-rich watershed in still Squamish. I was wondering about sediment transport and the landslide chapter in particular. I know Eric's presentation, he talked about other inputs of sediment besides landslides, like bank erosion and glacial input. I was just wondering how the model deals with that. Is that, do you know the ratio of, you know, the three inputs, and will that change over time with the glacial input and the bank erosion? Does that make sense?
I can answer as far as the covariates go, but we do not, since the recovery plan action was on the landsliding component, that's where we started. And now, as you could probably guess, we're confronted with how do we deal with that fraction with everything else. And there's not an available off-the-shelf covariate for, glacier peak turbidity and those sorts of things that we can just plug in. But I will say that Gus and Kurt are thinking about that stuff, and you might, they're going to do a presentation on the 15th if Richard or somebody wants to post the Zoom link, but they'll have a lot more detail about their work. And I'd say that the topic is a work in progress on how to integrate it with the model.
Great, thanks.
All right, thanks, Pat. Let's go to Craig.
Hi, very nice presentations from both of you. Mike, I have kind of a naive question about the modeling, and it looks like the NLS model didn't do as well because the confidence interval was narrower. At least there were more outliers because the confidence interval was narrower. And when you look at the amount of variation explained, or something like a Kaike information criterion, does the SSM model do much better?
Yes, it does better on that front, and we shouldn't expect the NLS to perform overly well with this kind of time series data. I mean, its ability to attribute variation over time. So the state space model has a correlative function in it to deal with the time variation that helps it address that a little bit better. The NLS is a little bit more constrained in how it's dealing with the air structure within the model, and it overly compresses it. I ran into this when I was doing just even simply a adult steelhead model. At the same time, Mark and Casey and Eric were doing the state space steelhead model. So.
Is the NLS model a lot simpler?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I should be honest with you, it's Casey and Sarah who are the modeling analysts that we have here. So it's complicated enough that I have a hard time working through the code.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Craig. And then I think we have one more question in the chat from Catherine. Do you have a published version of your findings?
Working on it, should be ready by the end of the month.
Great. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions, and I know we're just a few minutes over time. So with that, I think I'll just say thanks everyone so much for joining us today. And thank you, Mike and Eric, for sharing about your great work.
Thank you to the audience.